Archie, ain't we lucky that we're here to see our little girl getting married? Where is the little girl?
She was America's favorite TV mom, a warm, sweet, soft-spoken presence who brought a rare kind of grace to every scene. Jean Stapleton, forever known as Edith Bunker, captured the hearts of millions on All in the Family. But behind the gentle laughter and endearing mannerisms was a woman of fierce integrity, quiet strength, and deeply held convictions. She chose her roles carefully. She protected her emotional space, and when she said she would never work with someone again, she meant it. For decades, fans speculated. Rumors swirled. Whispers in the industry hinted at a rift, one that Jean never publicly discussed. But the tension was real. There was one man, one co-star, who crossed a line that she never forgot. And when producers tried to bring them back together, even just once, she refused. Not out of spite, not out of ego, but out of principle. Now, years after her passing, the full story has quietly emerged, from old letters, insider interviews, and testimonies from those who were there. And what we've learned is more disturbing, more emotional, and more heartbreaking than anyone expected. This isn't just a story about a professional fallout. It's about the emotional cost of standing up for yourself in an industry that often asks women to stay quiet. And it proves that behind Jean Stapleton's soft voice was a woman who would not be silenced. Long before the headlines, before the whispers began to circle around sound stages and studio hallways, Jean Stapleton had already made her decision in silence. It wasn't a dramatic exit or a public statement. It was something far more powerful. Her refusal. Her quiet, unshakable refusal to ever work with him again. And the man in question? Not a stranger, not a passing guest star, but someone she had once shared intimate scenes with. Someone she had stood across from under hot studio lights, rehearsed lines with, laughed with, even trusted. But something shifted. Something subtle at first. A comment here. A glare there. A disregard for boundaries that slowly evolved into something colder. His name was never shouted in outrage, but those who paid attention knew something was wrong. His presence, once just another part of the cast, began to disrupt the balance Jean Stapleton held dear. She wasn't loud about her discomfort, Jean never was. But she didn't need to be. She carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that spoke volumes. While cameras rolled and audiences laughed, something darker was unfolding behind the scenes. The man in question, an actor who never quite matched the tone of the show, had developed a reputation for pushing limits. Not necessarily in the open, but just beneath the surface. His jokes weren't jokes. His critiques weren't constructive. And the way he looked at Jean during rehearsals, dismissive, mocking, almost territorial, left her unsettled. She mentioned it to no one at first, because in Hollywood, a woman of her generation was taught to endure, to avoid conflict, to keep the peace. But inside, a line had been crossed. It wasn't one single incident, it was a pattern. A slow erosion of respect. A growing awareness that the warmth and mutual care she had built with Carol O'Connor, Rob Reiner, and the rest of the All in the family did not extend to this man. He had been brought in as a recurring character, someone meant to shake up the narrative, to challenge Edith's grace with blunt force. And behind the scenes, he seemed to enjoy pushing that same imbalance. He would question her notes, roll his eyes at her preparation, and interrupt takes as if he were the director himself. But worst of all, he belittled the very thing Jean brought to the show, the emotional nuance, the kindness, the empathy. He called it too soft, too sentimental, outdated, and he made no effort to hide his disdain. Jean, who had trained in theater, who had studied under the greats and carried a quiet reverence for the craft, was being talked down to like a beginner, and yet she never snapped. She never made a scene. She absorbed the discomfort like a stone in her shoe, there, painful, constant, but not loud enough to alert the world. Only her closest confidants noticed the change. Her energy shifted. She smiled a little less. She spent more time alone in her dressing room. And when the arc of that co-star came to a natural end, Jean didn't clap. She didn't cry. She simply walked away from the final table read with a calm resolve and never looked back. When asked later if she'd ever consider working with him again, on stage, on screen, even in passing, her answer was final. "No," she said, with a gentleness that didn't mask its weight. No, that won't be happening. And now, all these years later, the letters and quiet testimonies from those who witnessed those moments paint a clearer picture. Jean wasn't protecting herself from one bad experience. She was protecting her peace, her integrity, and her legacy. And the man she refused to work with again? He may have walked away thinking she'd forgotten. But she hadn't. She had simply chosen to remember in silence. And that silence, it turns out, said everything. The name, when it finally surfaced, came as a shock to some. But to those who had been watching closely, it made perfect sense. David Dukes. A talented but intense character actor known for his sharp features and even sharper tongue, Dukes had joined All in the Family during its later years in a controversial guest role. On paper, he was perfect for the part. An intellectual elitist, cold and smug, meant to contrast Edith's warmth with his icy detachment. But the trouble began long before the cameras rolled. In rehearsals, Jean Stapleton had tried to welcome him, as she always did. She believed in professionalism, in building trust between scene partners. But David, younger and fiercely opinionated, had little interest in camaraderie. He was methodical to a fault, interrupting table reads with unsolicited notes, questioning Jean's character choices, and rolling his eyes during direction, especially when the scene called for Edith to feel rather than perform. According to crew members, his behavior was not explosive, but it was corrosive, like a steady drip of acid that wore down the atmosphere one moment at a time. Jean, always the peacemaker, kept her discomfort private at first, but as filming progressed, her silence became a signal. She avoided eye contact. She shortened conversations. She stopped staying behind to work through difficult scenes. It wasn't fear, it was self-preservation. David's on-set energy was cold, cutting, and dismissive, and while other cast members shrugged it off as artistic eccentricity, Jean saw it for what it was, a fundamental lack of respect. The turning point came during a scene that demanded deep emotional vulnerability from Edith. Jean, always the consummate professional, arrived early, fully prepared. David, however, arrived late, unrehearsed, and agitated. When the scene began, he broke character mid-shot to question the script, loudly suggesting that Edith's reaction was too naive, and that no real woman would respond that way. The room fell silent. Jean, visibly stunned, stood still for several long seconds. Then, without raising her voice, she said, "Maybe the problem isn't the writing. Maybe the problem is you don't believe in her." It was the closest anyone ever saw Jean Stapleton come to confrontation. After that, the distance between them became a chasm. Even in the scenes where their characters were meant to interact, there was a visible chill, noticed by fans who couldn't quite explain why certain episodes felt so off. The warmth of Edith met a wall of ice in Dukes' delivery, and the chemistry that had made the show famous fell flat in those moments. When the arc of his character ended, Jean didn't complain. She didn't push for punishment. She simply made a vow, and when offered a chance years later to appear alongside David Dukes in a PBS special, something small, something harmless, she declined without hesitation. "We didn't work well together," she told the producer plainly. But behind that polite phrasing was a deeper truth. She had given him her professionalism, her patience, her trust, and he had met it with condescension. And in Jean's world, that was enough. Because for her, the work wasn't just about art, it was about respect. It was about creating something true with people who believed in the process. And that kind of belief required safety, humility, and empathy. Qualities she had in abundance, qualities Dukes in her eyes sorely lacked. And if you're still watching this story unfold, take a moment now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These aren't just forgotten names and backstage stories. They're truths that shaped television history. Drop a comment below. What do you remember most about Jean Stapleton's Edith Bunker? And did you ever notice the strange coldness in those late episodes? Your voice helps keep their legacy alive. In the years that followed, Jean never once revisited the subject publicly. But those close to her knew, and when she passed, quietly and with dignity, her journals, never meant for publication, revealed just one line beneath a list of co-stars. David Dukes once was more than enough. No anger. No theatrics, just closure. And in Jean's quiet way, That was all the truth she ever needed to share. In the emotionally charged and male-dominated world of 1970s television, where directors barked orders and egos collided under the heat of stage lights, Jean Stapleton stood out not because she was loud, but because she refused to be anything less than true to herself. Her quiet strength, often mistaken for meekness by outsiders, became something of a legend among those who worked closest to her. And it wasn't until the conflict with David Dukes that many began to fully understand the magnitude of that strength. Younger actresses, especially those new to the All in the Family set, watched Jean closely. She didn't gossip. She didn't whisper. She didn't play the political games that so many others relied on to survive in the industry. But when something crossed a line, Jean's demeanor shifted. Subtle, but powerful. She'd stiffen her shoulders. She'd fall silent. And more than once, she'd leave a room with nothing more than a small, exhausted sigh, because that was how she protested, not with fury, but with finality. After her decision to distance herself from David Dukes became known among the crew, it changed something. People started watching her with a different kind of respect, not just as the woman who played Edith Bunker with such heartbreaking tenderness, but as someone who commanded a deeper form of moral authority. Rob Reiner once said that Jean didn't just act Edith, she believed in her. And that belief didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. On set, Jean became a quiet protector. She wasn't overtly confrontational, but she knew when a young actress was being subtly dismissed or talked over during a read-through. She'd step in without making a show of it, sometimes by repeating the woman's suggestion more clearly, sometimes by simply holding eye contact with the offender until they backed down. And behind the scenes, women began going to Jean for advice, not about acting, but about how to survive the machine. Jean never offered gossip or easy answers, but she would tell them, "You don't have to let someone shrink your space." And for many, that sentence lingered long after they'd left the studio. Even men on the production crew began to notice the effect. One lighting technician recalled how Jean once refused to enter a rehearsal until a particular individual, known for his volatile temper, had left the room. She didn't explain. She didn't argue. She just stood there, arms crossed, eyes focused on a distant corner of the studio, until he quietly exited. It wasn't rebellion, it was resolve. She had built her career not on charm or controversy, but on conviction. And by the time she chose never to work with David Dukes again, it wasn't a scandal. It was a statement. A deeply personal one that resonated beyond scripts and sets. And it sent a ripple through the cast and crew, particularly among the women who had spent their careers pretending not to notice or feel when men crossed lines they shouldn't have. Jean showed them another way. That dignity wasn't weakness. That kindness wasn't permission. That boundaries didn't have to be screamed to be enforced. Her refusal to work with Dukes wasn't about revenge. It was about self-respect. She didn't need the last word. She already had it, in the way she carried herself. In the way her silence filled the space louder than any argument. And years later, when the show was long over, when interviews and retrospectives were being filmed and books were being written about the so-called golden age of television, Jean's name kept coming up, not just as a brilliant actress, but as a woman who drew her lines in quiet ink and never let them smudge. She may not have worn a crown, but everyone knew she was the moral compass on set. And the day she said no more was the day even the most powerful men learned. Jean Stapleton's silence was not surrender, it was sovereignty. In the end, Jean Stapleton didn't need headlines or public confrontations to be heard, because what she stood for echoed far louder than any press release ever could. She walked through her career with a rare grace, the kind that didn't demand applause but earned it anyway. And while others fought to be seen, Jean focused on being true. Her decision to never work with David Dukes again wasn't something she paraded or politicized. It was something she simply lived by, a quiet principle rooted in self-respect. Long after that chapter of her life had closed, producers, writers, and casting agents would still bring up her name in rooms where integrity was being discussed. Jean wouldn't do that, someone would say. And the room would fall silent, because everyone knew what it meant. She had become the gold standard, not just in performance, but in conduct. Not for being loud or controversial, but for never betraying the stillness of her own voice. And that perhaps was her most powerful rebellion. In an industry obsessed with noise, Jean's silence was its own kind of thunder. Her death in 2013 marked the end of an era, but her legacy didn't dim. Colleagues mourned her not just as Edith Bunker, but as the soul of a show that held a mirror to America. Letters poured in. Tributes filled the airwaves. But what stood out most were the stories from those she had quietly mentored. The extras, the assistants, the young actresses who recalled small moments where Jean had made them feel seen, safe, and heard in a world that too often ignored their voices. She hadn't needed to say much. A glance, a nod, a steady look across a table read. It was enough. That was her gift. She knew that dignity didn't have to shout. It could simply endure. And now, in hindsight, we begin to see that her refusal to work with one man wasn't just about discomfort. It was a quiet act of courage. A message to all the women who would come after her. You don't owe anyone your energy. You don't have to explain your boundaries. And you never ever have to shrink yourself to make someone else more comfortable. Jean didn't speak about David Dukes in interviews. She didn't reduce herself to petty stories or tabloid feuds. She let her choice speak for itself. And the fact that we're still talking about it today proves that she didn't need volume. She needed only truth. The industry has changed in some ways, but in many others, it hasn't. Women still walk onto sets unsure of how to defend their space without being labeled difficult. Still wonder if silence is survival or if it's complicity. But Jean Stapleton offered an alternative long before the world was ready to embrace it. A life of artistic excellence, personal integrity, and a refusal to be disrespected, ever. She will forever be remembered for her portrayal of Edith, yes. For the gentle voice, the comedic timing, the heartbreaking emotional honesty. But more than that, Jean will be remembered for the things she chose not to do. She chose not to retaliate, not to explain, not to return to a space that made her feel small. And by doing so, she showed the rest of us that you don't need to burn bridges to walk away from them. You just need to walk tall, in silence, and never turn back. And that's exactly what she did.